Not long ago, bureaucrats in Brussels could console themselves with the fact that, even if the EU wasn't a geopolitical superpower, it could nonetheless be plausibly described as a regulatory superpower. Thanks to the so-called Brussels effect, European regulations were being adopted the world over, allowing Europe to shape the rest of the world in its image and exert serious sway over policy in other jurisdictions. However, in recent months, Europe has struggled to flex its regulatory muscles as freely as it used to. So in this video, we're going to explain why the Brussels effect is apparently fading, and what this means for Europe. Recent elections in Denmark, Slovenia, Bulgaria, and Hungary have shaken up the state of European politics, with major new trends emerging. We dissect these elections in the latest issue of our magazine, as well as explaining what's changing in Europe. That's just one of the 80 pages in the magazine, because there's more to Too Long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So, let's start by quickly explaining what the Brussels effect is or was. The term was first coined in 2012 by Anu Bradford, a Columbia University law professor, riffing on the so-called California effect, which refers to the fact that regulations, and especially environmental regulations, set by California are often adopted by the rest of the US. This is in large part because most US companies want to operate in California, which is the biggest state economically, so they have to adapt to meet Californian standards anyway. This was a bit of a surprise. After all, for most of the 20th century, American policymakers have been more worried about essentially the opposite process, in the so-called Delaware effect, which describes how states, like Delaware, which has zero corporate tax for businesses operating outside the state, compete in a race to the bottom to attract businesses. Anyway, after coining the term in 2012, 8 years later, Bradford published a book titled Brussels Effect: How the European Union Rules the World. In that book, she noted that many European regulations and standards were essentially being adopted as global norms. Well-known examples today include the EU's famous CE marking, which is accepted as a quality guarantee the world over, the General Data Protection Regulation, or commonly known as GDPR, which has been copied into new legislation across more than 100 countries, or the directive requiring a single charger for all mobile devices in Europe, which is one of the big reasons that Apple dropped their Lightning cable and why basically every phone today uses USB-C. Like with the California effect, the globalization of European standards occurred in large part because multinationals adopted EU rules to sell to the European market, which just led other jurisdictions to either adopt or recognize the bloc standards. It was also just simpler for multinationals to adopt one single set of high and internationally recognized standards, like the EU's, rather than many different regulations for each country or market. Now, there was always some academic debate over the actual strength of the Brussels effect, and the extent to which corporations influence EU regulations rather than vice versa. Nonetheless, however strong it once was, there's a pretty widespread consensus that it's fading. For starters, the EU just hasn't had a GDPR or USB-C moment for a while, but instead there have been a couple of glaring examples of the EU being pressured into paring back its own regulatory ambitions. In November, for instance, the EU quietly delayed its landmark Artificial Intelligence Act in the face of opposition from the US and big tech companies. Barely a month later, the EU delayed its much-anticipated deforestation law, which would have required companies to prove that products don't contribute to deforestation, after pushback from industry and commodity-producing countries. So why is the Brussels effect fading? Well, we see at least three reasons. The first and most obvious is that the EU accounts for an ever-shrinking share of the global economy, which gives it less influence over regulatory norms. For context, the EU's share of global GDP in purchasing power terms has fallen from about 20% at the turn of the millennium to less than 15% today, and is expected to decline further in the coming years. Furthermore, multinationals no longer rely as much on European consumers as they once did. A decade or two ago, there were basically two big rich consumer markets, the US and Europe. Today, however, there are burgeoning middle classes across the globe, including in the Middle East and Asia, which means that multinationals are less reliant on European consumers. Secondly, European regulations have apparently just become a little bit too complicated and burdensome. Not only has this given multinationals an incentive to forego them and instead focus on other markets, in some cases the rules are so complicated that the EU itself lacks the bureaucratic bandwidth to actually enforce them. The EU's new medical device regulations, for instance, have been delayed because the EU literally doesn't have sufficient certification experts to enforce them, and has apparently deterred medtech companies from setting up shop in Europe. The EU itself seems to recognise and accept this criticism, with the recent digital omnibus proposal being explicitly framed as an attempt to simplify the EU's existing tech regulations. Third, the next big area of regulation is clearly going to be tech, as evidenced by the slew of social media bans sweeping the world at the moment, and the EU just doesn't have that much sway here. This is both because the EU just doesn't have that many big homegrown tech companies, and because the countries that do, namely China and the US, have made it clear that they will retaliate if they think the EU is regulating them too aggressively. Now, after all of this, you might be asking, who cares? Why does it matter if the rest of the world is copying the EU's rules and regulations? Well, the main reason is that if the Brussels effect is indeed dead, but the EU continues to legislate as if it were quote-unquote a regulatory superpower, this will put European companies at an acute disadvantage. Stringent environmental and social regulations didn't really undermine European competitiveness when everyone else adopted them anyway, thanks to the Brussels effect. But if the Brussels effect is dead and other jurisdictions don't adopt these rules, then that puts European companies at a unique disadvantage, because they basically end up as the only ones who have to go through all of this bureaucratic hassle. The point we're trying to make is that whether the Brussels effect still exists is not just an academic question. It should have some real bearing on the scope of the EU's regulatory ambitions. Furthermore, the Brussels effect was one of the few ways that the EU was able to wield global influence, and one of the few contexts in which the EU could reasonably be described as a superpower. Without the Brussels effect, and with the EU's soft power in decline more generally, it becomes increasingly difficult to see the EU as a superpower in any meaningful sense of the word. And if you're thinking that that was a lot to take on top of the thousands of other stories happening around the globe right now, you're not wrong. You might even feel powerless in today's climate. And we promise you, you're not alone in that. If, like us, you're looking for evidence that people can still make a difference, we know exactly the place to go. And that place is Planet Wild. Planet Wild is a community-based nature protection organization that is passionate about helping our planet, one step at a time. The power we have as a collective really shines bright through Planet Wild, as your membership directly funds a mission every month to give our planet a helping hand. These missions span from ensuring the ongoing survival of endangered animals like the grizzly bear, to cleaning up rivers before plastic reaches the ocean, and even rewilding Europe's last ancient forest. And with Planet Wild, you can know exactly what you're funding. They don't leave you wondering where your money is going, because they document all of these missions in video reports here on YouTube, so we can see exactly what we've helped to achieve. The impact we've made will be right before our eyes. Planet Wild is for those who are tired of words and want to see action. So if you want to join the growing community of people committed to actually making a difference, you can do so for as little as $6 a month, and every contribution matters, big or small. And if that hasn't convinced you, the first 100 people to sign up and use code NEWSEU6 will get their first month's membership paid for entirely by us. That's how passionate we are about Planet Wild. So by joining today, you'll immediately be able to make a difference and even see the impact you're having in less than 30 days on YouTube right here. You can cancel your membership at any time, so there's absolutely no catch. Just an easy, remarkable way to create real and lasting change. If you want to see them in action, then check out their latest mission protecting grizzly bears and other species by building the largest wildlife corridor in America.